In the late 19th century, an eccentric musician, woodworker, and shoe salesman named Orville Gibson put Kalamazoo, Michigan on the map as the epicenter of American guitar and mandolin innovation. His designs, which were informed by close study of early violin family instruments, began to earn the admiration of players around the world by the late 1890s. They also garnered attention from investors in West Michigan, who paid Orville for the rights to his business, his name, and his patents in 1902. For several years, Orville worked at least part-time for Gibson, for which he was paid a salary of $500 a year. However, what Gibson biographer Julius Belson later described as eccentric behavior led eventually to his separation from the company and his return to family in New York State, where he passed away in 1918. But his modern designs had laid the foundation for the new Gibson Mandolin and Guitar Company, which has continued to make guitar history both in Kalamazoo and elsewhere for more than a century. In the early years, Gibson instruments closely reflected Orville's distinctive designs. For example, the hand-carved or arched tops and backs. But at the turn of the century, demand was rising rapidly for many instruments, including banjos. And the new fad of local mandolin and guitar orchestras also increased the market for an array of instruments. The growth that was fueled by this demand led Gibson to build a new factory at 225 Parsons Street in Kalamazoo. The new facility sat next to the railroad tracks, where wood could be offloaded directly into the lumber yard. And it featured modern windows that allowed in natural light from all directions. While 1918 brought the end of World War I and the spread of the Spanish flu pandemic, it also brought Gibson into its new home and saw the hiring of design engineer Lloyd Lohr. Lohr is celebrated for his F-style mandolin and for standardizing the company's flagship L5 acoustic guitar, the first of its kind with F-holes. Both were among the most popular stringed instruments of the Roaring '20s, and surviving instruments signed by Lohr routinely fetch sums north of $100,000. Though the Great Depression decimated the American economy in the 1930s, blues, jazz, and hillbilly music all increased in popularity. The new Appalachian sounds of the Carter family and Bill Monroe, the modern swing jazz of Eddie Lang and Carl Kress, and the Delta blues of players like Robert Johnson are hallmark sounds in the history of early recorded American music, and all featured Gibson instruments. Yet two imperatives became obvious from the industry point of view during the Great Depression. Instruments needed to be more affordable during an era of economic hardship, and they needed to be able to compete with louder instruments like drums, woodwinds, pianos, and horns. The design and building of cheaper models, like the L00 flat-top acoustic, coupled with the arrival of the electric guitar pickup, helped to solidify Gibson's place in the history of 20th century music. Generations of future players would learn to play on relatively inexpensive Gibson instruments, purchased at dime stores or through catalogs, and guitar masters like Charlie Christian, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, and Les Paul and Mary Ford would now be able to amplify their sound. These made the guitar not only a mainstay in the boxcar, but on stage with the orchestra as well. By World War II, Kalamazoo was the largest producer of acoustic and electric guitars in the United States. But in order to help with the war effort, Gibson, like other manufacturers, altered their production for wartime industries. And while they did produce metal and wooden parts for the war effort, they also continued to employ some workers, most of whom were women, to build guitars. These Gibson gals produced thousands of the so-called banner guitars of the era, which featured the iconic headstock inlay, "Only a Gibson is good enough."